For 3 hours, the Japanese bunkers on Hill 208 tore the 1st Marine Division apart. 2 machine gun nests, reinforced with coral and steel, pinned down 70 Marines with no way forward and no way back, and then a 19-year-old private made a mistake with a grenade pin, and that mistake saved an entire company. This is the story of Private First Class Daniel Mercer, and how a bent piece of metal changed the fate of 70 Marines trapped in the jaws of death on Peleliu in September 1944, where the heat reached 110 degrees Fahrenheit and the humidity choked lungs like wet wool pressed against mouths, where coral rock cut through boot leather like broken glass and smoke hung like fog that never lifted, where the smell of rot mixed with cordite and diesel and blood created an atmosphere so thick you could taste metal on your tongue with every breath you took. The Japanese had carved bunkers deep into coral outcrops with interlocking fields of fire that covered every approach, connected by tunnel networks that made them nearly impossible to destroy from any single angle, their camouflaged firing ports invisible against the mottled gray-white coral until muzzle flashes gave them away for a split second before another burst of machine gun fire cut down anyone foolish enough to look or move or even breathe too loudly. The Marines had been ordered to take Hill 208 as part of the larger assault on Peleliu's ridgeline system, but 2 previous assaults had failed catastrophically with dozens of casualties, and now ammunition and water ran dangerously low while the tropical sun beat down mercilessly on men who hadn't slept in 48 hours, men who were beginning to understand that they might not survive the day. Among those 70 trapped men was Daniel Mercer, a kid from a wheat farm outside Salina, Kansas, originally trained as a radio operator who had joined the Marines in 1943 to escape the poverty that had crushed his family during the Depression. His radio pack destroyed by shrapnel 3 days earlier when a mortar round landed close enough to throw him 6 feet through the air, and now he was just another rifleman with a Springfield M1903 and a handful of grenades, exhausted and terrified but stubborn in that Kansas way that his father had always called too dumb to quit when quitting makes sense. His face was caked with coral dust that mixed with sweat to form a gray paste. His uniform was torn in 4 places. His canteen was down to a few mouthfuls of hot metallic-tasting water, and his hands shook whenever he tried to light a cigarette. But he kept moving forward because that's what Marines did, even when every instinct screamed to dig a hole and stay there until the war ended without you. That kid had eyes too big for his helmet, Sergeant James Rourke would recall years later during an interview for a regimental history project, his voice still carrying a note of wonder mixed with something like guilt. But God help you, he never backed down from anything. Not even when backing down was the smart play, the only play that made sense. And on that particular day, September 17, 1944, Mercer crouched in a shell crater that still smelled like explosive residue, the edges of the crater crumbling whenever he shifted his weight, sweat stinging his eyes so badly he had to keep wiping them with the back of his hand. His closest friend Morton wounded beside him and bleeding through his uniform from shrapnel wounds in his shoulder and thigh, while Japanese gunners zeroed in on their position with methodical precision, every attempt to move resulting in a burst of fire that kicked up coral fragments like horizontal rain. By noon the situation had deteriorated from bad to hopeless. The Marines had been pinned down for over 3 hours. The sun was directly overhead turning their helmets into ovens. 2 corpsmen had been hit trying to reach wounded men, and every attempt to flank the bunkers ended with Marines cut down in the crossfire or blown apart by mortars that the Japanese spotters called in with terrifying accuracy. The first bunker sat 30 yards ahead on a slight rise in the terrain, its firing slit barely visible in the coral face, protected by a natural slope that made grenade throws nearly impossible and direct assault suicidal. The second bunker was positioned 20 yards to the right and elevated another 10 feet, creating a perfect crossfire that covered the entire approach with overlapping fields of fire that left no dead ground, no safe route, no way forward that didn't mean certain death. Lieutenant Corman had tried sending a squad around the left flank an hour ago, and all 7 men were cut down before they made it 20 yards, their bodies still visible in the tall grass where they fell, and now the lieutenant sat with his back against a fallen palm tree, his map covered in blood from a head wound he didn't remember getting, trying to figure out how to save his men before division command ordered them to attack again and lose even more. If those bunkers weren't destroyed by sunset, if the Marines couldn't advance and secure the hill before dark, the Japanese would counterattack during the night and slaughter everyone caught in the open, and Lieutenant Corman knew it, and every man in that company knew it, and that knowledge sat in their guts like cold stone. That's when Mercer decided to do something, anything, because watching Morton bleed out while Japanese machine guns methodically searched for targets was worse than the fear of dying, worse than the rational certainty that he wouldn't survive the next 10 minutes if he moved from cover. He pulled a Mark II fragmentation grenade from his pouch, the pineapple-textured body warm from being pressed against his hip, and checked the safety lever with fingers that trembled from exhaustion and adrenaline and too much fear held too long. He repositioned his rifle, slinging it across his back so both hands would be free, and that's when the accident happened. As he adjusted his grip on the grenade, the pin slipped halfway out, bent slightly forward from being carried in a pouch that had been compressed by his body weight for days, and his heart stopped cold because he thought he'd armed the damn thing without meaning to, thought he had maybe 4 seconds before it detonated in his hand and killed him and Morton both. He froze completely, every muscle locked, afraid that even breathing wrong might jar the safety lever loose, and time seemed to stretch out impossibly long while he stared at the grenade in his dirt-crusted hand, at the pin sticking out at an odd angle, at the lever still seated firmly against the body. That's when Mercer decided to do something, anything, because watching Morton bleed out while Japanese machine guns methodically searched for targets was worse than the fear of dying, worse than the rational certainty that he wouldn't survive the next 10 minutes if he moved from cover. He pulled a Mark II fragmentation grenade from his pouch, the pineapple-textured body warm from being pressed against his hip, and checked the safety lever with fingers that trembled from exhaustion and adrenaline and too much fear held too long. He repositioned his rifle, slinging it across his back so both hands would be free, and that's when the accident happened. As he adjusted his grip on the grenade, the pin slipped halfway out, bent slightly forward from being carried in a pouch that had been compressed by his body weight for days, and his heart stopped cold because he thought he'd armed the damn thing without meaning to, thought he had maybe 4 seconds before it detonated in his hand and killed him and Morton both. He froze completely, every muscle locked, afraid that even breathing wrong might jar the safety lever loose, and time seemed to stretch out impossibly long while he stared at the grenade in his dirt-crusted hand, at the pin sticking out at an odd angle, at the lever still seated firmly against the body. Slowly, carefully, like defusing a bomb that was already ticking. He inspected the pin with shaking fingers, feeling the way it had bent forward maybe 10 degrees, creating friction against the hole it passed through, and he realized with a shock of relief that the grenade wasn't armed, wasn't about to explode, but the pin could now be pulled silently. No metallic ping, no sharp click, just smooth resistance as it slid free without making the distinctive sound that every soldier in every army had been trained to recognize as the last warning before explosion. His mind raced through the implications while machine gun fire cracked overhead and someone screamed for a corpsman 50 yards to his left, and suddenly he understood something crucial that might change everything. The Japanese bunker crews listened for that pin click, and when they heard it they ducked below their firing slits or pulled back from openings, which was why so many grenades failed to kill defenders who had that one precious second of warning to take cover or kick the grenade back out or simply move away from where it landed. But a silent grenade, a grenade that gave no warning until it was too late, that was something different entirely. That was a weapon the Japanese hadn't trained for and wouldn't expect and couldn't defend against if he could get close enough to use it. The realization hit him like electricity, like touching a live wire, and he tested the silent pull once more, feeling the pin slide free with only the faintest whisper of metal on metal, a sound completely inaudible over the ambient noise of battle, and the idea formed fully in his mind even as his hands started moving before his brain could catch up and tell him how insane this was. He would crawl to the first bunker under fire, get close enough to throw without warning, and hope that surprise would be enough to make the difference between success and just adding his body to the collection already littering the hillside. He looked at Morton, who was watching him with glassy eyes, and Morton must have seen something in his face because he grabbed Mercer's wrist and whispered, "Don't." But Mercer shook his head and whispered back, "Can't stay here. We're all dead if someone doesn't do something." And then he was moving before courage failed him, before rational thought could stop him, before fear could lock his muscles and keep him pinned in that crater until a mortar round found them or darkness fell and the Japanese came with bayonets. He left his cover in a low crawl, staying as flat as possible against the ground, and immediately bullets snapped inches above his head with that distinctive crack-snap sound that meant they were passing close enough to part his hair, dirt and coral fragments hitting his face. His elbows sinking in sticky mud that smelled like rot and chemicals. His knees scraping against sharp coral edges that cut through his trousers, and a bullet took a palm frond off right in front of his nose. The frond falling across his helmet with a soft rustle that seemed impossibly gentle compared to the violence happening all around him. Other Marines shouted at him, "Mercer, get back. That's suicide. And kid, don't be stupid." And somebody stopped that crazy bastard. But he ignored them all and kept crawling, yard by terrible yard, his world narrowing down to the next hand placement, the next knee movement, the next breath that might be his last. He could hear the Japanese machine gun ahead, that distinctive mechanical rhythm of the Type 92 heavy machine gun, and he could hear voices shouting in Japanese, orders being barked, and underneath it all the constant background noise of battle that had become so familiar he barely noticed it anymore. Rifle fire, grenade explosions, the crump of mortars, men screaming, men dying, the ordinary sounds of a Pacific island being torn apart by industrial violence. He crawled 30 yards that felt like 30 miles, every muscle burning, his lungs heaving, sweat pouring into his eyes, and then he was there, stopped only 10 feet from the bunker firing slit, close enough to see the muzzle blast clearly, close enough to hear the gun mechanism cycling, close enough to hear Japanese voices inside the bunker as clearly as if they were having a conversation right next to him. The loader calling out belt changes, the gunner confirming targets, a third voice that might have been an officer or NCO directing fire to new sectors. Inside that bunker, a two-man machine gun team worked with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this 100 times before, the loader feeding belts smoothly without looking, his hands knowing the rhythm by heart, the gunner adjusting elevation with tiny movements of the traversing handwheel, and a third soldier spotting targets through a separate vision slit and calling out ranges and directions while a fourth man waited with grenades in case any Americans got close enough to be a threat. They felt safe in their coral fortress, protected by 3 feet of solid rock and steel reinforcement, confident in their position and their weapons and their training, and they had no idea that a terrified Kansas farm boy was lying in the dirt 10 feet away with a bent grenade pin and nothing to lose. Mercer's hands shook so badly he had to grip his wrist with his other hand to steady it as he carefully pulled the pin, feeling it slide free with that eerie silence, just smooth resistance and then freedom, no click, no warning, no sound except his own breathing which seemed impossibly loud in his ears even though it was completely drowned out by the machine gun fire. He held the grenade with the safety lever pressed tight against the body, his thumb white-knuckled from the pressure, and he waited for the next burst of fire, counting the rhythm. 3-second burst, 2-second pause, 3-second burst, 2-second pause. The Japanese gunner was disciplined and consistent, and Mercer timed his throw to coincide with the next burst, using the sound and fury of the machine gun itself to mask any motion or sound he might make. He rose to one knee in a single fluid motion, his arm coming back and then snapping forward, the grenade leaving his hand in a perfect arc, and then he was flat on the ground again, hugging the earth like a lover, waiting for the explosion that would either save him or get him killed when the second bunker swiveled to fire at his position. Inside the bunker, the grenade hit metal, maybe a helmet, maybe the gun mount, with a sharp ping that made all 4 Japanese soldiers freeze for a split second, their brains processing the sound and arriving at the terrible conclusion simultaneously, and the grenade bounced once and landed behind the gunner in the worst possible position, settling into a corner where there was no escape and no time to pick it up and throw it back out. The explosion in that confined space was catastrophic, the overpressure alone enough to kill everyone inside. The steel fragments ricocheting off coral walls and metal surfaces, turning the bunker into a death trap, a steel coffin, a place where 4 men died in less than a second without time to scream or pray or think about anything at all. The machine gun went silent instantly, completely, and for a moment that silence was more shocking than the explosion had been, and then the second bunker opened fire with renewed fury, swiveling its gun toward the area where Mercer had thrown from, tracers cutting through the air like horizontal rain, bullets chewing up the ground, coral fragments flying like shrapnel. Japanese soldiers in the second bunker were shouting now, their voices carrying clearly in the relative quiet after the first bunker fell, and Mercer could hear panic in those voices, could hear them calling for reinforcements or reporting the loss or just expressing shock that someone had gotten close enough to destroy a fortified position that had seemed impregnable. A sniper from a position higher on the hill took aim at Mercer, the bullet passing so close he felt the pressure wave against his cheek, and Marines behind him were screaming for him to get back, to crawl back to safety, to quit while he was ahead and still alive, but Mercer knew with absolute certainty that if he retreated now the second bunker would cut down anyone who tried to advance, would pin down the company for another 3 hours or 6 hours or forever, and Morton would die another. Men would die and the mission would fail and the hill wouldn't be taken and more Marines would die tomorrow trying to do what he could do right now if he just didn't think about it too much. He had one grenade left, one chance, one opportunity to make a difference or die trying, and there wasn't time for fear anymore, wasn't time for rational thought or careful planning or anything except pure instinct and momentum. He exploded from cover in a sprint across open ground, running at an angle toward the second bunker, and immediately the world became muzzle flashes and impacts, bullets kicking up dirt all around his boots, tracers making bright lines through the air close enough to touch, heat waves from the sun making everything shimmer and distort like he was running through a dream or a nightmare or hell itself. A bullet ripped through his right sleeve without touching skin. Another grazed his canteen with a metallic ping that sent hot water spraying across his hip. A third hit the stock of his slung rifle hard enough to spin him halfway around, but he kept his feet and kept moving, his lungs burning, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst, his vision narrowing down to a tunnel that showed him nothing except the broken palm tree ahead that might offer cover if he could just reach it. Before the Japanese gunner adjusted his aim 6 inches to the left, he dove behind the fallen tree trunk with bullets chewing splinters from the wood, rolled twice, came up behind inadequate cover that wouldn't stop bullets but at least blocked line of sight, and he was only 12 feet from the second bunker now, close enough to smell the cordite and hot metal, close enough to hear not just voices but individual words in Japanese that he didn't understand but could interpret from tone. Anger, fear, determination, orders being shouted and acknowledged. Inside the second bunker, a replacement gunner had taken over, feeding a fresh belt, traversing to find targets, while a loader assisted and a grenadier prepared to throw a Type 97 stick grenade at the area where Mercer had disappeared, and an officer screamed orders to maintain fire discipline and watch for flanking movements. They were professional, they were prepared, and they had no idea that death was 12 feet away and closing. Mercer pulled out his last grenade with hands that had stopped shaking entirely, adrenaline overriding fear, training overriding thought, and he used the edge of his helmet rim to carefully bend the pin forward the same way the first one had been bent, creating that same friction, that same silent resistance. He tested it once, feeling the pin slide free without sound, and then reset it and gripped the grenade with his safety lever hand while his other hand found purchase on the rough coral ground. He listened to the rhythm of the machine gun, listened to the breathing pattern of their fire, counting bursts, 3 seconds on, 2 seconds off, 3 seconds on, and he noted the ventilation shaft that opened on this side of the bunker, a metal pipe maybe 6 inches across that vented smoke and cordite fumes, positioned about 8 feet up the coral face at an angle, and he knew that if he could get the grenade down that shaft it would detonate inside the bunker proper rather than bouncing off. The exterior. He pulled the pin silently, feeling it slide free with that eerie lack of sound. The safety lever pressed tight against his palm, and he counted 1001, 1002, and then he rose from cover in a single explosive movement, his body uncoiling like a spring, his arm coming back with the grenade, his eyes locked on that ventilation shaft, and everything moved in slow motion as he released, watching the grenade arc through the humid air, tumbling end over end, approaching the opening of the shaft, and for one terrible second he thought he'd missed, thought it would bounce off the coral, but the grenade dropped perfectly into the ventilation pipe and disappeared from sight. He was flat on the ground again before it detonated, his hands over his helmet, mouth open to equalize pressure, and then the explosion came, not from the firing slit this time but from multiple openings as the overpressure found every weakness in the structure, smoke and flame jetting from the ventilation shaft and firing slit and even from cracks in the coral that hadn't been visible before. The second machine gun collapsed into silence, the firing slit glowing orange from internal fire, black smoke pouring out in thick columns that rose straight up in the still humid air, and both bunkers were destroyed, 14 minutes from the moment Mercer had accidentally bent that first grenade pin to the moment the second bunker fell silent. 14 minutes that changed everything for 70 Marines who suddenly found themselves free to move after 3 hours of being pinned down and slowly picked off. The reaction was immediate. Marines surged forward with a roar that was part rage and part relief and part pure joy at being alive. Bar gunners firing into the smoking ruins of both bunkers. A flamethrower team rushing forward to clear any connected tunnels. Corpsmen sprinting to reach the wounded men they'd been unable to reach for hours, and everyone moving with the desperate energy of men who had been certain they were going to die and now suddenly weren't. Lieutenant Corman was on his feet despite his head wound, directing the assault with hand signals, sending squads to secure the approaches and establish a defensive perimeter, and Sergeant Rourke grabbed Mercer by the shoulders and shook him hard enough to rattle teeth. His face showing an emotion too complex to name. Fury and gratitude and disbelief all mixed together, while other Marines clapped Mercer on the back or punched his arm or just stared at him like he'd grown a second head. And someone was shouting, "Did you see that crazy son of a bitch?" And someone else was laughing with hysteria in the sound, and Morton was being lifted onto a stretcher by two corpsmen who moved with practiced efficiency. And Mercer knelt beside him in the dirt with his hands shaking again now that the adrenaline was fading, and Morton squeezed his arm with his good hand and whispered, "You crazy bastard, we're alive because of you?" His voice thick with pain and morphine and something that might have been awe. The battle for Hill 208 continued for another hour as Marines cleared the remaining positions and secured the crest. But the critical moment had passed. The deadlock had been broken, and 70 Marines who should have died that afternoon instead lived to fight another day, and they knew exactly who they had to thank for it. After the hill was finally secured and Japanese counterattacks had been repulsed and the company had been relieved by fresh troops, after the wounded had been evacuated and the dead had been recovered and buried and the official reports had been written, Mercer became a legend in the battalion almost overnight, gaining the nickname Silent Pin Mercer from men who asked him to teach them the trick with the bent pin, who wanted to know exactly how he'd done it and whether it could be replicated, and whether it might work again in future assaults. Flamethrower teams thanked him personally for saving their approach routes, because without those bunkers suppressed they would have been cut down before getting within 50 yards of their targets. And platoon commanders bought him drinks and clapped him on the back and told him he'd saved their asses and they wouldn't forget it. But Mercer himself never claimed he was brave, never accepted the praise with anything except embarrassed silence, and when people asked him about it he would just shrug and say it was all instinct and fear, that he'd been too scared to think clearly and too tired to know better, that the mistake with the pin had haunted him ever since because what if it hadn't bent, what if he hadn't noticed, what if he'd tried the same approach with a standard grenade that clicked when the pin came out and warned the defenders? He kept that bent pin as a reminder, carrying it in his pocket through the rest of the Peleliu campaign and then Okinawa and then all the way home to Kansas, and later in life he never spoke about the battle to his children or his grandchildren, taking those 14 minutes to his grave as something too heavy to put into words, too complicated to explain to people who hadn't been there and couldn't understand what it felt like to be that scared and that desperate and that certain you were going to die. There are no manuals for close combat in Pacific jungles. A Marine Corps historian would note decades later while reviewing the action reports from Peleliu, and what Private Mercer discovered that day, that silence could be as deadly as firepower, that innovation could emerge from accident, that a bent piece of metal could mean the difference between life and death, quietly influenced training protocols for generations of Marines who learned to think creatively under pressure, to observe the small details that others missed, to understand that the enemy listens for certain sounds and can be defeated when those sounds are absent. The technique itself was never officially adopted because it required damaging equipment and couldn't be reliably replicated, but the principle behind it, using surprise and silence and unexpected approaches to overcome fortified positions, became part of the institutional knowledge that Marines passed down through training and storytelling and the kind of hard-won experience that can't be written in manuals. War doesn't just forge heroes in the traditional sense of men who charge machine guns or hold hopeless positions or sacrifice themselves for their fellows, though it does that too. War also forges inventors and innovators, boys who use fear and instinct and desperate creativity to solve problems that shouldn't have solutions, who find ways to survive when survival seems impossible, who save lives through nothing more than paying attention to details that everyone else missed and having the courage to act on those observations even when action means certain death. On that smoke-filled hillside on Peleliu in September 1944, 70 Marines walked away from certain death because a 19-year-old kid from Kansas made a mistake that became a miracle, proving that sometimes the line between disaster and salvation is as thin as the friction on a grenade pin pulled in silence while machine guns scream and the world burns around you, that sometimes history turns on the smallest accidents and the most unlikely heroes, and that the difference between living and dying can come down to one bent piece of metal and one boy too stubborn or too scared or too determined to stay down when staying down meant watching his friends die.